Hello again, and welcome back to this series of videos from the North Somerset Educational Psychology Service. Today we're going to look at a topic which can elicit strong emotions in adults: self-harming or self-hurting behaviour in preschool children. We're going to consider why children hurt themselves and how we can reduce this behaviour by developing communication skills, providing safe alternatives, and teaching coping strategies. But first, let's look at what we mean by self-hurting or self-harming in early years settings. Common examples of self-hurting behaviour in toddlers and preschoolers are self-biting, self-scratching, and hair-pulling. And the most common example is head-banging. For example, banging a forehead on the floor, throwing themselves backwards to bang their head, or banging their head against a wall or door. It's estimated that 20% of children under 4 will deliberately bang their own heads at some point, with this typically peaking between 18 and 24 months and declining by the age of 4. Most often, we will see these self-hurting behaviours when a child is in the midst of a meltdown or a tantrum, and they seem to have this impulse to hurt themselves. As with all challenging behaviours in preschoolers, it's often impossible for the young person to give us a reason for their behaviour, and this means that it is crucial that the adults around them try to understand the source of the behaviour in order to prevent it becoming a problem. The key principle here is that all behaviour is communication. It's very rare for someone to enjoy pain or hurting themselves, and this means that when we see self-hurting behaviour, a child is trying to tell us something about their underlying needs or emotions. It could be that their language hasn't caught up with their emotions like anger and frustration yet, or they could be in pain due to an invisible medical issue, for example an ear infection or teething trouble. They might be copying what they see in other children, or it could be that the self-hurting or head-banging behaviour is being reinforced by a big, interesting reaction from the adults around them. What we see and what worries us in our early years settings is the self-harming behaviour. But if we're going to help reduce this behaviour, we need to understand where it is coming from, or in other words, what's going on beneath the surface. Understanding why children try to hurt themselves will help us select the most appropriate of the following strategies. However, it's fair to say that some children will benefit from us using all three of our top tips. So, the first tip is to develop children's emotional literacy, or in other words, help children understand their emotions so they can recognize them and label them. A nice way to do this is by playing emotions labeling games. For example, we can use picture cards or drawings depicting various emotions and ask children to identify and express how they feel in different situations. Or we can read them stories and ask them to guess the emotion of the different characters. We can even play specific games like Emotions Bingo, where we ask children to match pictures to the emotions that we are acting out. Another nice activity to help develop emotional literacy is using emotions dolls or puppets. This involves us buying or making dolls or puppets with different facial expressions representing emotions. We can then ask children to use these props to act out their feelings and think of ways to cope with them that do not involve self-hurting. We can also use traditional children's books and stories to teach children about their feelings. There are tons of great books written to help toddlers and preschoolers understand their emotions. My personal favourite is Ruby Finds a Worry, written by Tom Percival, who's from England. A final thing we can do to develop emotional literacy, and one that's particularly helpful for children with limited language skills or an autistic spectrum condition, is to use social stories. Social stories are short, clear stories about specific social situations in a comic book format. They use visuals and very simple language to explain more complex topics, such as self-hurting. We can make our own social stories with free apps such as SOFA, which stands for Stories Online for Autism, or download existing examples from websites like the SEN Resource Source. The next top tip is especially useful for children with delayed physical skills and sensory processing skills. Sometimes children will hurt themselves because they are in a phase of learning about their body, what feels nice, what feels scary, and what feels painful. For these children, our best tactic is to provide safe activities to learn about their senses. An obvious example of this is to use sensory toys such as chew toys or squeezy or stress ball toys. What's less obvious but equally true is that every time we give children activities that promote body awareness, like moving through space, swinging, hanging, balancing, jumping, we're helping them develop their physical and sensory skills. Although most children do not need any encouragement to swing, jump, and generally go crazy during playtimes, some children will not engage in these activities without our prompting and praising. Parachute play and balancing using therapy balls, tricycles, or body boards help children learn about their body and what feels good or painful in a safe, supervised, and structured way. And so, to our final tip for reducing self-hurting behaviour, and that is to teach coping strategies. Coping strategies are things that children can do to cope with big, strong emotions. As infants, our default coping strategy is to cry and cry and cry and cry until we are so exhausted that we feel calm again. But we can teach children more effective and safe ways for coping with strong emotions. For one example, we can teach children relaxation by using a calming sensory corner. To do this, we create a designated area with sensory materials like soft pillows, bean bags, and stuffed animals. Encourage children to go to the corner when they get frustrated or upset, allowing them to engage in calming activities such as deep breathing or playing with the sensory toys. Another example is to teach children to distract themselves using sensory bottles. This involves filling bottles with calming materials such as water, glitter, and slow-moving objects. When children feel frustrated, provide them with a distracting sensory bottle, allowing them to redirect their focus and self-regulate their emotions. The best approach to reducing self-hurting behaviour in preschool children involves us experimenting to establish what the behaviour is communicating. Is it a sensory issue? If so, I'll provide an alternative. Is it a failure of communication? If so, I'll help them develop their vocabulary so that they can label their feelings. Although it can be difficult, we really want to avoid accidentally reinforcing the behaviour by giving big, scared reactions which children are likely to find unusual and therefore want to see more of. In the best cases, we can acknowledge the behaviour without reinforcing it, for example by saying, "I wonder if you're feeling cross because you didn't want to finish playing with the trains." If we have provided opportunities for children to develop their emotional literacy, sensory processing skills, and coping strategies, while also avoiding reinforcing or rewarding self-hurting behaviour, we have done our best to tackle the source of the problem. In the very rare case that headbanging, for example, persists despite our experimenting, it will be important to share our concerns with parents, which can perhaps form the basis of a medical referral. And finally, let's not forget about safeguarding. Challenging behaviours in young children can sometimes indicate an underlying safeguarding need. As an early years practitioner, it's vital that you keep this in mind when supporting children who exhibit concerning behaviours like throwing, biting, fears and phobias, or separation anxiety. Remember, all behaviour communicates an unmet need. Take time to understand the possible function of the behaviour and what the child may be trying to communicate through their actions. Could the behaviour be a reaction to feeling unsafe or vulnerable in some way? Could the behaviour be a reflection of what the child has experienced at home? We need to make safeguarding a priority by looking beyond the behaviour to identify any potential welfare concerns. Be alert to signs of neglect, abuse, or exposure to domestic violence. Work closely with families, but avoid making assumptions. Focus on listening and building trust. Where you have any safeguarding concerns, no matter how small, ensure you follow your settings, procedures, and protocols. Record observations accurately and factually. Seek support from your designated safeguarding lead if you need guidance. With sensitivity, care, and professional curiosity, we can ensure early years settings are safe places where children's well-being is protected and they can thrive. Let's work together to keep children safe. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you found this video useful.